In this video, we're going to talk about how I made this cute little ice cream cart cookie out of royal icing. I started by making royal icing transfers for the ice cream cones. Royal icing transfers are basically homemade sprinkles, but you can make them pretty intricate. So I printed off a sheet that had mini ice cream cones on it, and then I taped that to a baking tray. And then next I took a cellophane bag, I cut it in half so I had two sheets, and then I taped that sheet down on top of the ice cream cones. I like to tape everything in place just so that when I move the tray out of the way, it's all going to stay put. You can also use parchment paper instead of cellophane. The benefit of parchment is that it's going to dry much faster. The downside is with parchment paper, it'll warp as it's drying, and so your transfers won't dry super flat on the underside like it would on cellophane. Once everything was in place, I started piping the design. So I started with just doing the ice cream cone in brown. And this is just a flood consistency royal icing. It's the same exact icing I'm going to use on the cookies later on. After all the cones were piped on, I let that dry for 4 hours, and then I came back with a slightly stiffer icing and I did the waffle cone design on top of the cones. And then right away I came back with a flood consistency pink and green icing to do the ice cream scoop. I left a little bit of space between the ice cream and the cone because we're going to come back and do the ruffly part of the scoop next. I let this dry for just about 15 minutes because it didn't matter if the ice cream was still a little bit wet when we came back for this step. And I made sure to overlap the icing with the ice cream scoop and the cone so that when it dries, it's just one solid transfer. I let it dry for another 4 hours, and honestly that wasn't quite enough time, and the underside of the transfers were just a little bit tacky, and they should be dry enough that they fall right off of the cellophane bag. Alright, so next we're going to talk about the cookie itself, and in between steps of the transfers drying, I was working on the cookie. You don't need to do all of one before we move on to the other. I started by laying some icing down and then using my scraper to scrape it flat. I wanted this to have the look of being the back of the cart and have some depth compared to the rest of the icing. Next, I put down all of my outlines just because there's a lot of lines on this cart and I wanted to make sure I had it all mapped out appropriately. This icing is a toothpaste consistency. I don't always use a stiffer icing for my outlines, but here I wanted to because again there are so many lines and I wanted them to be really exact. After all the outlines were in place, I came back and did some lines in these skinnier sections. This is to help prevent cratering, and that's when the icing has these dents or holes or dips down in skinnier sections. It's not an issue in the larger areas when you're flooding. Alright, so now it's time to start flooding now that all the outlines are in place. The theme of this cookie is basically just flooding every other section. And so we're allowing each of these flooded sections to dry before doing the section right next to it. And then it's going to have this nice defined line in between the floods, and you don't have to go back on top of it to do these outlines again. To help speed up the drying process and to help prevent that cratering, I did use my oven as I would a dehydrator. And so I have the oven set to 170 Fahrenheit, and I put the cookie in after this step right here for 5 minutes with the door cracked open, and that's going to make the icing dry much quicker, and I can just go right back to flooding after it comes out. So after the cookie was cooled from being in the oven, for just a few minutes, I came back to flooding and I could do the sections right next to the previous section. So you see there's the pink next to the pink, but there's still a defined line between the sections. They don't run together. And then I skipped down and I flooded that bar going horizontally across the top of the stand. And after that's flooded, I went back up and I finished the white sections on the awning. I just wanted to allow a few seconds for that pink icing to crust over slightly before doing the white sections, just in case they touched each other and they didn't want them to run together. And then after this step, I put it back in the oven for 5 minutes with the door cracked open. And then after it was cooled, I came back and I flooded the vertical lines and I put it in the oven again one more time. If you don't want to use your oven this way or you don't have a dehydrator, you can also just use a fan and blow air on the cookie in between each step as well. Next, I took my stiffer, like toothpaste consistency brown icing. I did the pegs on the wheel, and then I did the outline of the wheel, and then I came back with my flood consistency brown icing to do the wheel itself. And then next I attached my cute little ice cream transfers that I made earlier. So each cookie gets 4 ice cream transfers. I did every other color, pink, green, and I just used a little bit of white flood consistency royal icing to glue them in place. And then once the icing transfers were in place, I put it through the oven one last time because I didn't want that wheel to crater. And I could have stopped here, but I felt like it needed just a few more finishing details, and so I took a really stiff consistency icing to do some florals. And then I took my toothpaste consistency white icing just to do a little bit on top of the wheel so that it was covered and looked like it was inside of the wagon instead of on top of it. And there you have it. That's how I made this ice cream cart cookie, and here you can see it with the other cookies from this set.